Awesome. So before I do, I wanted to just add a word of comments on the matter. I think this is a fantastic idea. I just want to comment on this. Every time I've described this in the last few days, I spoke about this with a few friends. They all said, this is fantastic. I spoke with a friend in finance who said, well, we should do it for finance too. And then, there was a broad notion. And I think it is a fantastic idea for several reasons. But one of those is that we really don't know what's happening behind the scene. And frankly, it took me forever to figure it out. And to figure out that some roadblocks I was hitting are very common, and how to think about those, and so on. And so, yeah, I just wanted to commend the initiative that really is phenomenal. So, all right, enough commending. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to present you called basic, the fundamental intuition of a paper that was written by myself together with Andrea Pratt, who at the time was my colleague at Columbia, Malesh Pai, who's at Rice, and Pepe Montelolea, who is today at Cornell, but at the time was also at Columbia. And it's a paper that is a theory paper that we published at the QJE in, I should know that, 2022, I'm going to guess. Relatively recently, and that we worked on, broadly speaking, from I shouldn't tell you much, sorry, but that we worked on for a few years before that. And the idea of the paper goes essentially along the following lines. I'm gonna pose to you, first of all, a theory problem, and then I'm going to try to convince you that this theory problem is not just relevant because theorists enjoy solving problems, which undoubtedly we do, but it may have some glimpse of an actual real-world implication. So think about the following task. You have a bunch of people, potentially a bunch of people, each of whom is fully Bayesian, and each of whom is attempting to predict a certain variable, I'm going to call it y, using a bunch of observables. And just to make it concrete and to make it not too abstract, suppose that the data you observe is your browsing data because I have access to your cookies. And I'm trying to predict what type of shoes you're into, whether you want running shoes, like Sav would probably want, or whether you want hiking shoes, or whether you want ballet shoes, or whether you want yada yada. Because maybe I am, what's the name, shoes.com, whatever, a shoes seller that is trying to make sure I give you the right ad. Now, suppose that everybody agrees that the relationship between the observables and the object you're trying to predict is linear. But what we don't know and we don't agree upon is what are the factors here, what are the betas that are involved, and what is the noise term. I suppose that there is potentially heterogeneity about this object. Now, suppose that all of us are going to make a certain prediction about y. All of us observing the same data. Okay, so we all observe a bunch of cookies and a bunch of data points, and we all train using the same information. So, for example, to make another example, we're all trying to predict the GDP of 2026 for Iceland, and we use IMF data. We have the same data set. But of course, we may disagree as to what are the factors that go into the Icelandic GDP. Now, the crucial, of course, as such, this is a very generic problem that doesn't mean much. A lot of people have studied it. Here, we want to study a special version of this problem in which the different people have different priors about which covariates matter. For example, there may be person A who may think that what shoes should you like is fully predictable just by looking at which website you visit. Okay, I just see whether you've been to NewYorkTimes.com, TheGuardian.com, and YouTube.com. That tells me that you're really into hiking shoes. If instead you go to whatever, Fox News, you're really into ballet. Okay, let's just... now, this is one person. Person B thinks, well, the world is a little bit complicated, more complicated. The only thing that is not just which website you visit, but also how long you spend there. If you go to foxnews.com and you spend about half a second, that's not going to count quite as much. If instead you go to YouTube and you spend 5 hours, then it's going to count more. I think person B is probably very reasonable in that. I think we can think about that. Person C may say, no, you need more. Not only which website you see, how long you spend, but also in which order do you see them? Do you start from Fox News and end up at the New York Times? Or do you start from the New York Times and end up at Fox News? This is going to describe a different person. Now, if you think about it, these three people are trying to make the same prediction. And the idea of shoe size sounds silly, but it's a practical problem for market retailers that are using cookies to make these predictions. And they're trying to predict the same covariates using the same variables, except that B has a more complex model in mind because they're going to use more covariates, not just which website, but also how much time you spend. And C adds yet another covariate. So these three agents have different priors because they think about different subsets of covariates. And so what we want to ask is, all right, how is the number of covariates you consider, put differently, how big is your model going to impact what type of predictions you're going to make? Now, when I present these sort of ideas to economic theorists, the typical answer I get is, dude, what are you talking about? Everybody should use everything. This is ridiculous. Why waste information? True, although I would induce you to think about this statement, the amount of data that is truly available is way too much to be used in full. Suppose you're really trying to predict the GDP of Iceland and you use all data available. Is my shoe size matter? Does it matter? Because if you're using all data available, Pietro's shoe size should be impactful in understanding the GDP of Iceland. I don't know if we should use it, right? And I don't think most people do. I never received an email from the Prime Minister of Iceland asking me for my shoe size. So what I'm trying to say is that, sure, potentially you can use everything, but in practice, people don't. There are too many things, and people may disagree about how big of a model do we need. And so what we ask is, how does the size of the model impact your title decision? In particular, we're going to ask the following specific type of question. What I want to ask is not what type of prediction do people make, but who among these people, say amongst A, B, C, ends up being more confident about their ability to predict. So suppose that there's me, there's Sav, and there's Vatsal that have different models. And suppose that we're going to make our predictions. What I care about is not only who has the more correct prediction, the answer is obvious, the person who has the right model. But the question that I'm interested in is who amongst us is more convinced that they know. Now notice that this is subtle because I'm making the game a little bit more complicated, because what I'm asking is not who is objectively right, but who believes that they're right. In particular, what we can do and what we do in the paper is that what we're going to do is that we're going to normalize the ex-ante confidence so that even though we may be using different models, before observing any data, we have the same confidence. And then I'm going to ask, how does the arrival of data, the fact that we observe 100, 1,000 data points, 1,000,000 data points, how does it affect our relative confidence? And does one of us become more or less confident than the other? Now, before I tell you the results, let me just motivate the question a little bit more. You may ask, why do I care about confidence? Why is that an important metric to understand? I would claim that a lot of decisions are built upon the role of confidence. For example, so let's make a very concrete example. There's me, there's Sav, and I use a super simple model that I think nails it. I think I can predict everything. I'm an overconfident dude, which probably I am, and I think I can make this prediction quite spot on. Then, instead, Sav is a more sophisticated woman, and she realizes that she looks at this and says, I don't know, this is a complicated problem. There's a lot of things we don't observe. So, we don't have enough data to quite say it. Now, who amongst us is going to win the Google auction to put the ad? I will. Who's going to win the Facebook auction to put the ad? I will. Right? So who's going to enter the market aggressively? I will. Sev, coherently, she will know that this is not, there is risk involved. In general, confidence is relevant because the people who really believe they know, they're going to invest more on their ability to predict, and therefore they may end up affecting the predictions themselves. What we find, and I'm going to call it preview, but in fact, these are the main results of the paper, is the following, that model dimensions matter too. To phrase it differently, the amount of competition, the competition amongst Bayesians generate what you can call a model selection that is driven by model dimension in the following sense. The winner, meaning the person who is most confident, is going to be the person who has the smallest sum of model error, meaning how well does their model fit the data, plus essentially the ratio between model dimensions and, meaning how many covariates you're considering, and number of observations. So if Seb and I have a model that performs equally well, and we observe the same data, which is what I'm assuming throughout, if my model is smaller, I'm going to be more confident. Of course, if my model doesn't perform well, now there's going to be a trade-off. And literally the trade-off is in an additive form, literally by model error plus a ratio. So something we're quite happy about is that you get an extremely clean result. Now, something that may sound not entirely obvious ex ante is that you get this model selection in which smaller models tend to be outperforming, even though everybody's Bayesian. Usually on the Bayes rule, you don't have an advantage of smaller models. For those of you, and I'm just mostly referring to the theorists in the room, you know that smaller models are given an advantage in Lasso or Akaike because you want to provide some type of regularization. You want to prevent overfitting. With Bayes rule, you don't need that. The prior is taking care of overfitting. And yet we showed that something akin to a punishment for larger models happens even for Bayesians once you look at the metric of who's most confident. And in particular, an implication of all of this is that when samples are small, so you have small data points, people with small models do better. Not that they do better in that they actually predict better. They don't. They need not to. They may predict better if they're the right model. They may mispredict if they're the wrong model, but they really think they get it right. Which is essentially when data is scarce, people with a simplistic view of the world are going to be overconfident. When data becomes large, you get a bit of a funny result. Of course, when data goes to infinity, we all converge to the right model, and that's for sure. And of course, a wrong model, a misspecified model never wins because you have infinite data, people are Bayesian. It better be. And of course, you also get the true model wins with positive probability, which is also kind of intuitive. But what you also find is that when data goes to infinity, overly complex models now gain a competitive advantage. You can prove that there are specific situations in which overly complex models tend to be selected in this system. So effectively, and just to wrap up, this is a way to obtain something quite similar to the literature in statistics, machine learning, and econometrics that goes into model selection. Like you may remember Lasso from grad school. In this literature, there's a lot of ideas like the Akaike information criterion, which are very similar from ours. They're saying use the model that minimizes the sample variance plus the ratio of number of regression and number of observations. This is a standard thing in econometrics. In those situations, it was motivated by the argument, we want a model that doesn't overfit. And so because I want to I'm going to show that to avoid it using a worst case scenario kind of reasoning, I'm going to punish models that are too large. Instead, here, we generate the same model selection, but not through avoiding overfitting or min-max reasoning, but by looking at purely Bayesian people and by looking at who's actually going to win, who's the most confident. So we get literally the same result to the point that in some specification is mathematically the same equation, but through a different channel. And so, ours is mostly a positive foundation, not a normative foundation of criteria of this type of why such criteria may emerge. And I think I'm over time already. I thought I was going to be short on time, but yeah. So I should shut up. But
amazing. Thank you so much. It was super clear. So that's the time. Vatsal is going to share the link to the survey. And meanwhile, while you're going over the survey, we're going to have a chat with Pietro, thinking a little bit about the collaboration. So there are 4 co-authors on the project, and you can see there's a bit of econometrics, a bit of macro theory, putting all these things together. So yeah, how did this come about?
So let me tell you the story. So I like to work with my friends. I think it's something I quite realize in life, that it's too short not to hang out with friends. And so I often pick people I like that I think are smart, and then we end up with a project. And the world is full of nice projects. These specific ones followed a rather unusual route in which I kind of felt young, which is Andrea Pratt, who was my colleague and friend at Columbia, and I decided that we wanted to understand something about machine learning. So what did we do? We bought a textbook and we started studying it. And it's not like I do something very often. So it's not like I do it very often, but we did it in that time. Turns out that if you're a macroeconomic theorist, the basic of machine learning are fairly natural to us. The language is similar. It's very easy, and it's very enticing in a way. That there's a lot of cool results there. So Andrea and I started thinking about it, and we started having. So in machine learning, there are all of these ideas that are related to what we find. We should discuss how we came to the exact idea later. But so we started working on it, and then we realized that we probably needed someone with a bit more knowledge of this connection. And we had a friend, Malesh, who worked on related topics very well. There's a beautiful paper on essentially something related to VC dimension, which, if you know machine learning, you would probably recognize here. And so we thought we had an idea, and then we said, let's give a call to Malesh and let's chat with him about it. And then we chatted with him, and he said, "This is great." We thought about it, and we went on, and then we realized that, in fact, what we were talking about is essentially respinning a lot of some econometric results, which is the last part I taught. And so what did I do? Well, I have a good friend who's an econometrician, who's Pepe, with whom I played squash. So we went to play squash. And then I said, Pepe, why we play squash and we beat this rubber ball against the wall? Why don't you tell me about Akaike and what's the normative versus positive foundations of Akaike? So we started chatting, and one thing led to another, and off we went. So that's the story of this collaboration.
Yeah, that's that's exciting to think about. I mean, in a sense, were they all at your institution at the time? No, Malesh was not?
Malesh wasn't. Malesh was it was at Rice, so we were mostly remote. We flew over. There were a few steps of the proof that required a bunch of people in front of a board. So this really varies across discipline, across subfields of economics, and also across people. There's people that are very accustomed to working together on Zoom and can really pull it off. Personally, I do it too, and most of my co-authors are all over the planet. But that moment, those days that you spend together in front of a board are just another level. Also fun because it's another layer. And so yeah.
How do you select your co-authors? I mean, there's some. So you said, of course, friends, and so we can go and think about the lexicographic ordering here. But in a sense, how do you think about complementarities in production? Is that something that?
Good. Excellent. I think this is an excellent question. I wish I could tell you I'm very strategic. I'm not. I just wing it. But I can tell you, but you know, evolutionary survival helps in the following sense. There are co-authorships I've had for many years because my co-author and I are extremely complementary, and this has helped the professional relationship endure for longer. In other cases, we're more overlapping, and so it's a little bit less obvious. But in my historically, I feel like naturally, or you know, either some people have some inclination. There are people that are better at writing the introduction. There are people that are better at checking the epsilon and deltas of the proofs, and those things happen. Sometimes they happen endogenously, like in a couple. You know, sometimes the two individuals may get together and then they specialize without any planning. But you know, somebody cooks and the other one irons, and these things also happen. Um, Frankly, if I have to look back and look at my most enduring not relationship, but rather professional relationships, I'm gonna joke is that they are all characterized by some pretty substantial degree of complementarity, and also a pretty clear division of labor. So if I think about some of the people I wrote most papers with, um, there are things we know, there are roles we immediately fall to. And so we know where to go and we don't sort of step on each other's toes. There's no egos being brushed if you do something, which also matter. Um, in other cases, I don't. I start working with some other people. Sometimes things work well, sometimes they don't. I had some horrible stories of people with whom I didn't click, and you know the relationship turned sour. But yeah, but I think if I have to look back, I think some degree of complementarity helps, or at the very least, some degree of a clear division of labor helps. This is particularly important when seniority start becoming asymmetric, because then you may have the wrong expectation of both sides, not necessarily only the senior expecting the junior to do everything, which is unfortunately true, but also, you know, some sense of who's going to take care of what. Yeah. So, and I think a typical mistake that I've made in co-authorship, and I've seen many people make in co-authorship, is not setting expectations clear early on about timeline, about amount of effort, about involvement with the project, and so on. So typically when things go sour is because somebody's busy with too many projects, they took too much on, and then the other people get pissed. And I've made this mistake myself of taking too much on and pissing off my co-authors, which usually involved sending wine all over the country to get forgiven. But yeah, it helps.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. Vassal, do you know how are we doing in terms of survey answers?
We're doing well. I think we can start. Just a reminder for the audience, in case you haven't filled the survey yet, you can still continue, and we'll just go through the first few questions in a go, and then you can fill the survey in your own time. So should I share my screen and then we can go through it one by one? Just a second. Perfect. All right. So you can see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question was, how many years do you think it took the researchers to go from conceiving the idea to getting it published? We had a range of 0 to 10, and I'm going to show you the true answer now. And that was...
I'm going to put an epsilon around it, truth. True answer up to Pietro's decayed memory, but yes.
Let me take the next one as well. How many times do you think the presenters presented the paper at an external conference or seminar before submitting it? And what you said was more than 4 times.
Yep.
And then finally, let's go to this one. How many journals do you think? Actually, let's just take the first 2. Maybe you want to speak about the origin of the idea here, and then we take questions on the publication process afterwards.
Yeah, so great. So in terms of time, this was a little bit unusual because sometimes, you know, you have papers that are that are very well defined, meaning there's an existing paper that make an assumption and you say, what if I change this assumption? What if, many theory papers are like this, many experimental papers are like that. Oh, we have done this experiment in which we give people this information. What if we take the information away? Very natural. The question comes immediately. Now, the implementation may be hard. Proving the theory may be hard. Finding the right design may be hard. But in a way, considering the idea is where you start, is what you start with. This paper was a bit funky because, as I said, we started thinking about this broad class by literally a machine learning textbook. And it came from the fact that at some point where the intuition that something like this was going to pull. In particular, that essentially our intuition was people with overly simplistic model are going to be overconfident. And so that's essentially the story we thought. And then we said, all right, really? Is that true? In which sense it is true? And then it took us years. First of all, it takes you years to come up with the exact theory question. And then there is the beautiful band that I always describe to my students. A theory question must be hard enough to be interesting and easy enough to be solvable. And of course, what happens is that you throw ideas, you don't hit the band. Sometimes you get something that is trivial that you can prove in 30 seconds. And sometimes you hit something that wouldn't it be amazing, but who knows whether it's true. And that's at some point we started, by keep on throwing darts, we hit something in the sweet spot, and then we developed it. And so I think that's how it came. And then there was some publication part. We presented it. The way it worked is that I essentially never submit a paper unless I present it a few times. I don't know if this is the right approach. It really depends on how often you get to present. If you don't see yourself presenting too often, I wouldn't wait too long, because then you're letting stuff sit and it's a bad idea. But frankly, the reason why I think this is essential is not really for the feedback, about the feedback from the audience, which does matter. For example, I presented it once at Harvard, and Drew Fuderberg gave us, it was at Harvard at the time, gave us phenomenal feedback. So, sometimes the feedback you get is just spot on. Other times, presenting it changes your mind about the paper. Is only after I write a slide deck and I present it and I hear myself say it that I realize what's actually interesting about the paper. And I often think that when I was a young researcher, I was not flexible enough to pivot about identifying the right idea. So you may have a few results, but the right pitch may be very different from what you started with. And not being flexible to pivot and identify the right pitch is a mistake that I used to make, and I believe other people are making too. And so, yeah, that's and so to me, presenting it, hearing myself speak, looking at the audience faces when I present it, whether I feel like I'm on control, I have a good story, or whether I feel like, I'm dragging it. This is not moving by itself. I need to drag it at every step. It's really a feeling that I get after I present. And so, yeah, this was presented definitely more than 4 times.
Pietro, if I can ask a question on duration.
Yeah.
Do you think the 4 years is like representative of the length of your projects? Or do you think that there is like also crazy skew?
Well, I have projects that have been out for 12 years, easily. I have projects that are about to graduate college. Not quite, but well, do have a project that is starting grad school, and I'm afraid that has been a minute. But I think 4 years, if you don't count, let's say, from the moment in which the idea has a shape, so I can describe the broad idea to a friend, to the moment in which I get an acceptance letter, I think is not an unusual amount. I think it's a fair number. I had papers that were published much faster. I had paper that went in less than a year, and as I said, I had papers that took the sweet time to come out, and much frustration. Also, the point is that once it goes above a certain number of years, personally, I get discouraged. I get upset. I start hating it. All the psychological aspects that come with it. I've had many of those. So, yeah.
All right, let's take a couple of questions on the publication process. So here, this one is, how many journals do you think the researchers submitted to before the paper was accepted, where it's published? He said 3 times.
Yep, 3 times.
Let's take one more. How many rounds of revisions do you think the paper went through after receiving the first response? Majority say 2. You said 2 times as well.
Yeah.
And how many months? This is interesting. How many months do you think it took the researchers to address the comments of the referee? And you said 10 months. Let's take all 3 in one go. Yeah.
So let me describe it. So we submitted it. So okay, this paper is a bit of a weird, funny publication story. We submitted it 3 times before landing at the QJ. We submitted it first at Econometrica, where it was desk rejected. And it was desk rejected because it was considered an econometrics submission, and it wasn't clear why in econometrics you would care about confidence, about individual subjective confidence, which is incorrect. I've done something at the time which I never do, and as an editor I deeply hate, which is appeal to it. But it went nowhere, as you would expect. But this is maybe indicative of the fact that how you frame the abstract and the first few lines of the papers define who does it goes to. And so we were really emphasizing here the connection with econometrics and with the Heike and Lasso and so on. And that was evidently a mistake, because if you get the wrong set of referees, you're in trouble. And I think this is also an aspect that people don't quite realize. Then we did something funny. We sent to the AER, and I had my most unusual experience, which is we had 5 referees, 4 positive and 1 on the fence, and the paper was rejected. Which was rather upsetting at the time, I must confess. Although is the editor's prerogative, and I respect it, and it's okay. Also that very editor accepted a paper of mine with 4 negative referees and nobody positive, and he accepted it right away. So I feel like the karma, in the grand scheme of things, I've received my I'm in a net positive, but that was a bit unusual. And I think the point is that the editor at the time didn't quite understand why the question was interesting. So he just thought, that's a cool theory result, but why should we care? Why is that right? So then we sent it to the JP, where it was rejected. I don't remember how. It was an unremarkable rejection, one of the many unremarkable rejections that I've received in my life. And then we sent it to the QJ. And the QJ was a bit unusual, because we received 3 positive, and although 1 kind of weakish, and 1 negative. And then Andre Schleifer, who's handling it, gave us a reject and a submit, which is unusual for that. But essentially said, look, I like the paper, everybody likes it, but you got to give me a motivation. Give me a story of why do I care. And we did, and he really liked it. And so effectively, the true answer is that he went through 2 revisions, but it's a little bit unfair. It essentially accepted the paper after the first revision, but he asked us to do another round in which we were fixing aesthetics, so details. So there's always a funny last revision that means little, and in which, once you receive it, you already celebrate. And that, so effectively it was 1 revision. And then in terms of times, I think we took 10 months, but mostly because we were slow. One of us had the baby. In the meanwhile, the life came in and went in between. But broadly speaking, I think 10 months is not unusual. I also think is on average a bad idea. I think that replying too quickly is a mistake, but waiting 10 months is a mistake because people incorrectly believe that you didn't put enough effort. So I wouldn't send something back in 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. But if you can put something back in like 3 months, 4 months, it's going to be much better, because the editor and the referees are going to remember. Because remember, the editors forget everything right away. At least I do. I don't remember anything. And so, if after 10 months, I have no idea that paper ever existed. So
All right. Let's take a few more. How much do you think the final results of this paper aligned with the presenter's original prior? There you said somewhat aligned. How many times do you think the pitch of the paper was revised? Okay, you said once. And once the pitch was finalized, how many times do you think the introduction was changed for stylistic reasons? And you said 3 to 5. I think you've already spoken about some of this, but is there something that you wanna
No,
add?
I just want to say that I think that this paper there was a major change in pitch at some point, but that's unusual. Usually, I have more than one change in pitch. This is a relatively stable papers. I think every good paper have been pitched very differently at some point. And in terms of rewriting the introduction, I wrote 3 to 5 times, which is true, but maybe something that I should emphasize is that one of these was a change in pitch, which was very substantial, and the others were like relatively easy changes. But there is a little bit of seniority that comes into it, in the sense that I think Andrea and I both are overconfident about our writing of introductions, and therefore don't revise it too much. But I think in general, it's a mistake. So in general, I think it's a good idea to revise many more than 3 to 5 times. My earlier papers, the answer would have been 80. For real.
How did the pitch change then?
Good. So the pitch began with what I told you was this rejected at Econometrica, which was, about Lasso, that people have smaller models because they should, to avoid overfitting. Now I'm going to give you a different story of why this may emerge spontaneously through a selection of who was most confident. And instead, that pitch really didn't fly. It didn't fly in the talks, it didn't fly in the journals. It's not true that it didn't fly. To the right audience, I think it flew. And in fact, to the right audience, I think is one of the coolest results we have. But you cannot choose your audience, and the referees are not your audience. They are not your chosen audience, and so this was a mistake. And so we had to rephrase it in a way that was making it more appealing. And then over time, within the context of that pitch, we added a bunch of applications to auctions, to factors of financial analysis and so on, which all made the paper a little bit more applicable. It had a sense of more applicability.
Is that something you recommend in general? Like, how do you think about the number of applications, or how to motivate? We had a discussion recently. I was at a workshop talking about applied theory and thinking about pure versus applied, and trying to think about this drive to find applications. Do you have insights you can share with us on?
To be honest, I used to hate applications. Also, I started my research role in decision theory, and I remember my advisor telling me, and now we have to write the application. And I was thinking, this is like, I don't know, having to do the dishes. You just had your wonderful meal, and now you have to do the boring part. I really hated it. I felt like I was terribly unsuited for it. I was selling my soul to some sense of horrible, and it was really terrible. At some layer, I've changed, but in the following sense. I think sometimes you find applications that are really dragged by the feet, meaning this, like, I need an application, and here's my application. I think there's another point, which is, why should we care about it? One thing is finding an application, which is really a full-fledged application. Another one is trying to formalize the idea. Why should a general, I don't want to say economist, because no macroeconomist will ever care about anything I do. But how should a general economic theorist or microeconomist at some level think that what I do is making a contribution? How would I explain it? Can I think about the pitch of the paper? Can I do the elevator pitch, the one we tell job market candidates to develop? And that, in my view, is something you really develop as you present the paper, but it really helps the paper. So if I if I have to look back, I realized that my paper became much better once I fine-tuned the elevator pitch of what is the paper actually doing and why should actually people care. And being clear on those dimensions is something that I didn't used to be too much. I wanted to prove the hard theorem. I had my hard theorem and I was proud of it. And I was saying, look at how hard the theorem is. And instead, really, the take-home message, the simple intuition is something I was disregarding, and I think many theorists, especially when they're young, tend to disregard, and I think is a mistake. If you can explain the results quickly to a broader audience, it's almost surely a much better result. It's not true, broadly speaking. There's very little algebraic topology you can explain, but to a broader audience. But this type of results you should be able to do.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that.
All right. And we had on a scale of 1 to 5, how challenging do you think each of those tasks were? Of course, it was not quite right to put data collection and analysis in this, but this is what the audience said. So on average, this is a 2.2, a 3.4, 3.3 for writing and structuring, and 3.1 on average for the peer review. And this is what you said. I've removed these, and we've got your responses here. And similarly, there was a question on time use, and we can get back to the slide in a second. What percentage of total calendar time was spent on these different aspects of the paper? This is what the audience's guess was on average. And this is what yours was. So do you want to talk about these?
Yeah, so this is a bit unfair because coming up with the research idea is a bit unfair because, as I said, this is the research idea that came through a process of learning. So it's a bit unfair to say that it came easily. I don't know if it came easily. It came because we put a lot of effort into this stuff. At some point, we hit something. But definitely what took us the most time was developing it. So proving the theorems in generality, this was a long process by an order of magnitude. And then, of course, writing and structuring the paper, not really because of writing and structuring, but by this I understand also, writing and structuring, after a while, it becomes easy. What really took us time is pivoting, changing our mind, figuring out when we realize that things weren't going the right way, how are you going to rethink it? So if I could break this writing and structuring into two subparts, one is writing the first draft. This would be a 0.1, and thinking about how to revise it after you realize it doesn't work. This is a much longer process. And then navigating the peer review is always a pain. In this case, it was rather unusual. I had papers that were rejected after revisions 3 times. And those were painful, and there was years of navigation, and here it was painful because we received all of this feedback that we were trying to incorporate somewhat, and then the QGE we had one round which again took us 10 months, but that we had some work to do. But yeah, I think for other papers, the navigatory peer review is probably even bigger. Certainly in terms of frustration.
And in terms of time use, how much was the gap between your econometric desk reject and then, how much time did it take you to refine the pitch and then submit again?
Maybe a month.
Oh, wow.
Even less. At some point, because we were all pissed. And so we met and we started, anger helps. Don't get me wrong. By the way, it looks like I'm complaining with Econometrica. They did the right thing. We used the wrong pitch. We really framed it incorrectly. They sent it to the right referees, who judged it for the way the paper was framed, and then they thought I don't care, and so it looks like we were upset with ourselves because we've clearly made the rookie mistake of framing the paper incorrectly.
Do you have recommendations on how long should you wait before the next submission?
Okay, most of my co-authors have the attitude you don't react to rejections. meaning you read the reports, maybe you just resubmit, and they would claim, and I had this conversation a billion times with essentially all of my co-authors, not all, but 80% of my co-authors. They say, let's not get into it. I think it's a mistake in the following sense. Reading the details of the comments of the referees, expecting the referee may come back, is not always a good idea, because you're overreacting to something and you may really deviate from the optimal. On the other hand, sometimes there is a broad message. People are reading. So let's go back to the earlier point. What's the elevator pitch of the paper? What's a basic contribution? Are people getting the elevator pitch? Is it coming across clearly? Is the main contribution coming across clearly? And why it's relevant coming across clearly? Sometimes, and this was true for this paper, and this has been true for many papers in my life, I had these points were not coming across clearly. The main what actually was the main contribution wasn't coming across clearly, and that was highlighted by the rejections. And so I'm a little bit of two minds. Overreacting to rejection is silly, but trying to take the really high level message of why aren't people happy with the paper, I think there's something that is useful. Again, going to section 7 and fixing every detail, probably not particularly helpful.
All right, we've reached the end of our questions, so we can probably open it up to the audience if they want to ask you something. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Can I ask a question? Hi, Pietro. Nice to see you. Hi.
Nice to see you.
I was wondering, actually, you have many papers and many great papers. Which one of that is your favorite among those papers?
Of my papers?
Yeah. Which one is the one that you are most proud of?
In Italian, there is an expression: every cockroach looks beautiful to his own mother.
Sure.
So I have a lot of
Personally.
cockroaches that are my little cockroaches, and they're all my little cockroaches, and they're so beautiful to me, each and every one of those. But like every mother, I have a favorite. I have a few favorites. I mean, personally, the first paper I wrote that I actually liked was my paper on non-Bayesian updating. It was my becoming an adult paper.
paper.
Exactly. That was the paper I should have used as a job market paper if I didn't decide to go on the market early, before everybody, which was a creative idea. But that was that was my first paper that I wrote, and I said, all right, this is my cockroach. And then the cautious expect utility paper with Simone and Dudi. It's a decision theory paper on the L paradox. That's a paper we wrote in 5 hours. I'm not kidding you. We were in Moscow at a conference. It was minus, 28. We were stuck in a room and we started chatting, and then we wrote the paper. It was, Dudi and I were working on something related. Simone was working on something related. We started chatting. We wrote the paper. 3 weeks later, I gave it as a job talk at Columbia, which was, a gutsy move because the paper didn't exist at the time, but it worked out. So, I'm also emotionally attached to the paper. So I think these are my most obvious ones. Yeah. But there are others. I mean, I feel like I'm leaving other beautiful cockroaches unmentioned, and it's really a pity.
Sure. Thanks.
Of course. Thank you. See you.
I mean, in a sense, the cautious expect utility paper is a great example of like the synergy effects, right? Like clearly you guys had like bringing all your background and your knowledge and bringing this to the paper. And so that's really when you have these complementarities in terms of combining ideas that you worked on, that can really first be creative, but also rely on your strengths.
And also, this is one of my favorite example of co-authorships, in the sense that David Dillenberger and Simone are fantastic friends and I'm very, very close to, but we're also extremely complementary in terms of style. We have very different attitudes. I'm impulsive and aggressive and jump into conclusions immediately. Simone is careful and says, wait, Pietro, and Dudi is, you know, we each of us of our personalities that complement each other very well, and I think it's it's part of the pleasure, to be honest. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Pietro, can I ask a question?
I have none. Of course you can.
I have to say that Pietro was one of my advisors on the committee, so I already said thanks many times, but this is another opportunity, so thanks for everything.
Thank you. Pleasure was mine.
I have a more general question related to what's in the, in the back scenes, but maybe what could have been. I wonder what is your take about double-blind processes and whether that could help, ruin, change how things are taken. I mean, acting as someone comes, from a small university, small department, these things, you always get the feeling that they hurt you in the margins. I mean, if you write a great paper, it's a great paper. I think everybody realizes that. But sometimes you feel like it, might hurt those coming from small places. And in general, I mean, maybe for practical purposes, it's very difficult today, but I think if the editor asks me as a reviewer, to treat it as a proper blind paper, probably many people will respect that. So that's my question.
Excellent. It's not just, it's an excellent question that a lot of people are talking about. In that you probably know that there was massive reports created by the co-editors, by the editorial boards of various journals that are talking about the introduction of possible changes. Okay, I'm going to give you my gut feelings, and like every unprocessed gut feeling, is going to be contradictory. Okay, but let me tell you the multiple forces that I think are at play. On the one hand, despite everybody's trying, and I think a lot of people are trying, there is some degree of discrimination against people that are less well known. I think the university of origin is less essential, but it does matter. But it is true that if you are a giant in your field and you submit a paper, people are going to read it differently. I cited Drew before, and let me cite him again. If somebody like Drew writes a paper in the field I've just presented, people are going to read it and say, all right, Drew wrote it. It's probably very smart. If a young person who's not well established in the field does the same, now I need much more. Now, I picked extreme examples, but I think in a broad sense, this is true. And pretending it's not is just putting our head under the sand. Now, this being said, there is a question of how can you make it happen. One way is to say it is to really make it double blind. There's people who even say triple blind, so not even editors should know. That I think is a dangerous road, because you really have to avoid conflicts of interest. It's very complicated. It's also because the subtlety is not just the conflicts of interest that are obvious, same institution, but also same cliques. So you probably know there are some subfields of our profession in which everybody's accepting each other. And so you need to navigate those things and so. But for double blind, I think is not. I think it's actually feasible if you ask. So can we guarantee double blind? No, but I share your view that asking is probably going to go some way. Is it going to go all the way? I don't know, because I think that a lot of papers people are somewhat unsure about, and so at some point they're going to Google the person. The other thing that unfortunately this may mean is the following: that is going to give an even bigger advantage to people who are very prominent and present everywhere. Because you see, if you are a very prominent person in the field, you do the rounds, you go to the Chromatic Society plenary speaking, you know, people in the field would have seen there were years in which if the paper in decision theory was written in broadly defined on risk preferences, I would see it 4 times minimum, if this person was doing the circle of conferences. And so maybe my take on this is that it's impossible to be really double blind, what we would do is maybe transfer the benefit away from everybody with a Ivy League affiliation to more concentrated to the people who do more rounds. It's probably going to increase the incentives to go to conferences and get your name known, for better or worse. Now, this probably means that if you come from a country that doesn't have much research funds, now you're going to suffer because you can't get your paper known beforehand. But maybe it's better than the current situation in which if you come from a country with little research funds, you're probably already discriminated against. Yeah, that's my, those are my 2 cents. Very unprocessed.
Thanks a lot. So better to just write good papers, I think.
Better to write, yeah, so true, but most importantly, better to write great papers and write good introductions so that people read them through. Yeah. But yes, I agree. Market for lemons. I would like to write that.
Yeah, another idea for a paper. Great. Thank you so much, Pietro, for this fantastic talk. That was
Thank you.
I learned a lot, despite knowing the paper and a subset of the co-authors at least. Yeah, that was great. And yeah, thank you so much to the audience for participating and engaging.
Thank you, everybody. It was great to see many friends. And thanks to everyone.
So.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.